There is a melody that haunts the darkest corners of London, a single, sorrowful violin note that seems to hang in the air long after it's been played. It's a sound that chills the blood and quickens the pulse, and for those who have heard it, life is never quite the same again. Some say it's a ghost. Others believe it's a madman, but for one man, the only man in this city who truly listens, it is the beginning of a puzzle. And there is nothing Sherlock Holmes loves more than a puzzle. Picture this, a foggy evening on Baker Street. The gas lamps cast long, trembling shadows across the wet cobblestones. Inside 221B, the fire crackles, and the great detective himself sits with eyes closed, fingertips pressed together as if holding the very threads of reason. Beside him, Dr. John Watson, ever loyal, ever watchful, waits. He knows that look. It is the look that means something is stirring in the mind of Sherlock Holmes, something strange, something compelling, something that defies all ordinary explanation. And then the doorbell rings. A visitor arrives breathless, pale with fear, speaking of impossible thefts carried out in plain sight. Precious artifacts vanish without a trace. No broken locks, no forced entry, nothing out of place, but for one eerie, lingering detail. A single haunting strain of violin music hangs in the air long after the crime is done. It is a mystery that seems to taunt the very laws of nature. A mystery that calls for the keenest of minds, the sharpest of instincts. A mystery, in other words, for Sherlock Holmes. So settle in, lean closer, and let your imagination take you back to a London where every shadow holds a secret, and every melody might just be a clue. This is no ordinary case. This is the adventure of the masked violinist. The frantic ringing of the bell was followed by the sound of heavy, hurried footsteps upon the stair. A moment later, our sitting room door was thrust open to reveal a man in a state of such profound agitation that he seemed to vibrate with it. He was a gentleman of late middle age, his portly figure clad in an exquisitely tailored coat of black broadcloth, and a waistcoat of embroidered silk that spoke of immense wealth. Yet all this opulence was utterly contradicted by his ashen complexion and the wild, terrified look in his eyes. He stood for a moment on the threshold, his chest heaving, his gloved hands opening and closing at his sides, as if grasping for a reality that had just slipped through his fingers. "Mr. Holmes, thank God you are at home," he gasped, his voice a strained, reedy thing. "I am Alastair Finch, of Finch Manor in Kensington. I have been robbed." The final word emerged as a choked sob, and he staggered forward, collapsing into the basket chair that Holmes silently indicated. Watson, with his impeccable bedside manner, immediately poured a measure of brandy and pressed it into the man's trembling hand. "Compose yourself, sir. You are among friends. Now, from the beginning, what has been taken?" Finch gulped the brandy, a measure of color returning to his cheeks. "It is my violin, gentlemen, my most prized possession, a Stradivarius, crafted by the master's own hand in 1698. It was irreplaceable." Beyond value, he looked from Watson to Holmes, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I have a vault, you see, a modern marvel of security, steel walls, a lock with a combination known only to myself, not a single window. The door was still locked, the combination untampered with, and yet it is gone." Holmes, who had been observing the man with the intensity of a raptor, steepled his fingers. "A fascinating conundrum, Mr. Finch. A phantom thief who walks through steel. You heard nothing, saw nothing amiss. Nothing, that is the horror of it." Finch cried, wringing his hands. "The household was asleep. My butler, a man of impeccable character, heard not a whisper, and yet he paused, his eyes glazing over as if recalling a dream. And yet I did hear something, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing over the day's affairs. I heard music, faint, so very faint, as if drifting from a great distance. A violin playing a sonata. It was beautiful but melancholic, a piece full of such profound sorrow, it made my own heart ache. I thought I was dreaming. I must have been, for who would be playing a violin in the gardens at such an hour? I fell back to sleep, and thought no more of it until this morning, when I went to the vault and found the pedestal empty. A slow, knowing smile touched Holmes's thin lips. His sharp eyes had not missed the way Finch's left eye developed a minute, frantic twitch when he mentioned the music, nor the way his fingers unconsciously plucked at the air, as if mimicking the playing of an instrument. The music, Mr. Finch, this sorrowful sonata. Can you hum the melody? Finch looked startled, then shook his head miserably. I cannot. It was like a half-remembered dream, the notes slipping away even as I tried to grasp them. But the feeling it left me with that remains, a deep, chilling sense of loss. Finch Manor stood as a grim, grey sentinel amidst the manicured lawns of Kensington, its wealth evident in the immaculate stonework and the polished gleam of its brass fittings. Yet an air of palpable dread seemed to emanate from its very foundations, as if the house itself were in mourning for its lost treasure. We were admitted by the butler, a tall, austere man named Graves, whose face was a mask of professional composure, though his eyes betrayed a deep and unsettling confusion. Alastair Finch led us directly to the heart of the mystery, his vault. It was, as he had described, a formidable structure built into the interior wall of his study. The steel door was massive, its surface a complex arrangement of dials and a single heavy lever. Holmes produced his lens and began a minute examination, his movements slow and precise. He scrutinized the dials, the handle, the very seams where the metal met the wall, his breath coming in soft, focused clouds in the cool, still air of the room. The combination lock shows no signs of tampering, he murmured almost to himself. No tiny scratches from a listening device, no residue of explosive to blow the mechanism. The hinges are on the inside, rendering them inaccessible. Mr. Finch, you are quite certain the combination remains your secret? Absolutely, Mr. Holmes, Finch affirmed, his voice echoing slightly in the barren room. I have never written it down. I change the digits monthly. I alone know the sequence. And your alarm system? Holmes asked, his eyes now tracing a thin, almost invisible wire that ran from the top of the doorframe to a bell on the far wall. This is a simple contact alarm. If the door were opened, this circuit would be broken and the bell would sound. It is still armed. Was it armed this morning when you discovered the theft? It was, Finch exclaimed. That is the most maddening part of it all. The alarm was still set. The door was still locked. It is as if my Stradivarius simply dissolved into the ether. Holmes did not answer. His attention had already shifted, his restless energy pulling him from the vault towards the rest of the study. He moved like a shadow, his gaze missing nothing. He examined the Persian rug for impressions, the surface of the mahogany desk for any faint dusting of debris, the bookshelves for any volume slightly out of place. He seemed less a man and more a force of pure deduction, absorbing every minute detail of the environment. It was then that he paused by a large, leaded glass window that looked out over the manor's sprawling rear gardens. It was the only window in the study, and it was shut fast with a sturdy brass latch. Was this window closed and locked when you entered the room this morning? Holmes inquired. Of course, Finch replied. I always ensure it is secure before I retire for the evening. Holmes's sharp eyes narrowed. With the utmost care, he unlatched the window and pushed it open. A faint, cool breeze drifted into the room. Leaning out, he surveyed the outside wall. It was a smooth, sheer drop of some 25 feet to a flagstone patio below, devoid of any drainpipe, ledge, or trellis that might offer a foothold to a climber. The wall itself was recently pointed, the mortar between the stones clean and sharp, offering no purchase for even the most skilled mountaineer. He pulled himself back inside, and now his examination became truly microscopic. He dropped to his knees, his lens once again in hand, and began to study the floorboards directly beneath the windowsill. He moved inches at a time, his nose almost touching the wood. Watson and I watched in silence, the only sound the soft whisper of Holmes's fingers brushing across the polished oak. "Observe, Watson," he said softly, without looking up. He pointed to a spot on the floor. "The housekeeper does her work admirably. The room is spotless, devoid of any noticeable dust. Yet here," he gestured for me to kneel beside him. "Do you see it, the most minute disturbance?" I peered through the lens and saw what his keen eyes had already captured. A tiny, almost imperceptible scattering of a strange, gritty, grey-white particles. So fine they looked like dust themselves, caught in the microscopic grain of the wood. It was nothing, and yet to Sherlock Holmes, it was everything. His investigation then turned to the window latch itself. He examined the simple brass mechanism from every angle, his lens hovering millimeters from the metal. He spent a full 5 minutes on this single task, his body perfectly still, his entire world condensed to that 1 square inch of brass. Finally, he let out a soft, satisfied sigh. "There, do you see, Watson, the most fascinating detail of all?" He handed me the lens and directed my gaze. On the underside of the latch, in a place that would never be touched by the hand of someone simply opening or closing the window, were 2 minuscule, parallel scratches. They were so fine they looked like hairs etched onto the metal, a tiny testament to an impossible intrusion. Holmes made no immediate pronouncement about the curious scratches or the strange dust, his silence a heavy, expectant thing in the study. Instead, he turned his attention away from the impossible vault and toward the people. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere, "we must speak with your staff. Every soul who was within these walls last night. The impossible, I find, often becomes decidedly possible once one accounts for the human element. They were assembled in the grand dining room, a line of anxious faces, the austere butler Graves, a skittish young footman, the stout cook, and 2 housemaids. Holmes paced before them like a lean, impatient wolf, his questions sharp and precise. He asked about routines, about any unfamiliar sounds in the night, about anything, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, that felt out of the ordinary. Most had nothing to report, only speaking of a quiet, uneventful evening. Then he came to the last of them, a young woman named Elsie. She couldn't have been more than 19, her hands nervously twisting the fabric of her apron, her eyes wide and fearful. When Holmes addressed her, her voice was little more than a trembling whisper. I think I saw something, sir," she confessed, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Or rather, I heard it first. It was late, and I was finishing the silver polishing in the pantry. The window was open just a crack to let in the cool air. And that's when I heard it." She paused, a shiver running through her slight frame. "Music, violin music. It was so beautiful, but so sad. It made my heart feel heavy just to listen to it." Holmes's entire demeanor shifted. The restless energy stilled, replaced by an intense, focused calm. "You are certain it was a violin, and it was coming from outside?" "Oh, yes, sir," she nodded vigorously. "It was clear as a bell. It sounded so close, like the player was right there in the garden. And after the music, Holmes pressed, his voice gentle but insistent. "What then?" "This is the part that sounds daft, sir," she whispered, her cheeks flushing. I heard it stop, and I was curious, so I peeked out the pantry window that looks onto the side garden. And I saw a man, just for a second. He was moving quick, like a shadow. He was tall, wearing a long dark coat, and he had a case, a long narrow case, like what a musician might carry. He was gone around the corner before I could even blink. She looked up, her eyes pleading for us to believe her. "I told Mr. Graves this morning, and he said I must have been dreaming, that my imagination was running away with me. But I wasn't. I heard it and I saw him." Holmes knelt slightly, bringing himself to her eye level, his expression not one of skepticism, but of profound interest. "Elsie, this is vitally important. The music you heard, you said it was sad. Can you recall the tune, however faintly? Could you hum it for me?" The girl looked terrified at the request, but she took a deep, shaky breath. She closed her eyes in concentration, and then, haltingly, she began to hum. The melody was fragmented, the notes uncertain, but the contour of it was unmistakable, a descending, mournful phrase, haunting in its simplicity. She managed only a few bars before she shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir, that's all I can remember. It's like it's fading." But for Sherlock Holmes, it was enough. A strange, almost electric energy seemed to crackle around him. He did not thank her or dismiss her. He simply turned on his heel, his eyes locking with mine, and in that glance I saw the blazing fire of certainty. The phantom had left a calling card, and my friend had just deciphered it. The impossible theft now had a sound, a shape, and a witness. The game against all odds was afoot. Holmes did not speak until we were once more in the relative privacy of the study. The door closed firmly on the hushed whispers of the household staff. He stood before the cold fireplace, his back to us, a coiled spring of intellectual energy. When he finally turned, his eyes held that singular, luminous quality that signaled a great leap in his reasoning. "The violin is the key, Watson," he began, his voice low and vibrant with suppressed excitement. "Not merely as the object stolen, but as the very heart of the mystery. Consider the facts we have been presented. A thief of seemingly supernatural ability bypasses a vault of steel to take one thing, and one thing only, a specific, priceless violin. He does not disturb a painting worth a king's ransom on the adjacent wall. He does not pocket a handful of gold sovereigns from a desk drawer left carelessly unlocked. His entire impossible endeavor is focused solely on that one instrument." He began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, each point landing with the precision of a master logician. "Now add to this the testimony of two independent witnesses, a wealthy financier and a scullery maid, who both describe hearing the same thing in the dead of night, a piece of violin music of profound and haunting melancholy. They could not hum the full melody, but the emotional impression it left was identical, a deep, resonant sorrow. This was not a jaunty tune played by a common street musician for coin. This was a complex sonata, played with a skill that left a lasting emotional impact on its listeners." He stopped his pacing and fixed me with that piercing gaze. "What does this tell us? It tells us that our thief is no ordinary burglar. A cracksman, a safe breaker, operates in silence and in shadow. He does not announce his presence with a serenade. This music was no accident. It was a deliberate part of the performance, and the specific piece chosen is not some common air, but a work of significant technical and emotional depth. I recognized the fragment the maid hummed. It is from a rarely performed sonata by the composer Francesco Maria Veracini, a piece so demanding in its virtuosity that it separates the gifted player from the true master. There are perhaps 3, maybe 4 men in all of London who possess both the technical prowess to play it flawlessly and the artistic sensitivity to imbue it with the profound sadness that was described. The sheer brilliance of his deduction was breathtaking. He had taken 2 seemingly minor, almost ghostly details and woven them into a portrait of the criminal. "So you are saying the thief is a violinist?" I asked, trying to follow his thread. "A disgruntled musician, not a violinist, Watson, the violinist," Holmes corrected, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A master of the highest order, and his motive is not mere avarice. If it were wealth he sought, he would have taken a dozen easier, more valuable items from this very house. No, this was a deeply personal quest. He did not want a violin, he wanted that violin, the Stradivarius. He coveted it not for its monetary value, but for what it represents, the pinnacle of the luthier's art, an instrument capable of producing a tone and responsiveness that a true artist would consider worth any risk to possess. This was a crime of passion, of obsession. A performer who believes he alone is worthy of such an instrument, taking what he feels the world has denied him." He moved to the window and looked out at the garden, his profile sharp against the grey light. "We are not hunting a common criminal. We are hunting a ghost who leaves behind a trail of music. An artist who treats his crime as his greatest performance, and every performance," he turned, a grim smile on his lips, "requires an encore." The strange tranquility that followed our initial investigation was shattered just 3 nights later by the frantic arrival of a telegram. It was past midnight, and Holmes, who had been brooding over his violin, playing melancholy strains that seemed to echo the very music we had been hunting, snatched the paper from the air as the delivery boy's footsteps receded down Baker Street. He scanned the message, and a grim, predatory smile spread across his features. He passed the telegram to me without a word. It was from a Lord Harrington Smythe, of a grand address in Mayfair. The wording was terse, almost panicked. "Another impossible theft. Come at once, the melody." It was the same melody. Holmes was already flinging on his coat, his eyes alight with a fierce and hungry energy. "The phantom has grown bold, Watson. He has performed his encore, and he has left his signature for us once more. Harrington House was a monument to inherited wealth and taste, a palatial residence filled with old masters and classical antiquities. Lord Smythe, a tall, gaunt man with the patrician bearing of a retired general, met us not with the terrified agitation of Alastair Finch, but with a cold, seething fury. He led us not to a steel vault, but to a velvet-lined display case in his vast library. The glass top of the case was intact, the lock unbroken, yet the interior was empty. It was my great-grandfather's, Smythe stated, his voice tight with controlled rage. A taut bow, crafted by Francois taught himself from the finest Pernambuco wood, inlaid with a silver tip and mother of pearl. It is the Stradivarius of bows, gentlemen, a national treasure. I had it displayed here, a point of pride for my family's patronage of the arts. He gestured angrily at the untouched case. The maids swear they heard nothing. The doors were all locked, and yet this morning it is gone. Holmes was already at the case, his lens hovering over the lock. And the music, Lord Smythe? He asked without looking up. The telegram mentioned a melody. A shadow passed over the aristocrat's face, his anger momentarily displaced by a flicker of something akin to awe. Yes, the music. I was awake, reading late. The house was utterly silent. And then it began. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. a single violin, playing a piece of such unutterable sadness that it felt funereal. It was the same phrase, over and over, a lament that seemed to seep into the very stones of the house. It lasted for several minutes, and then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I thought I was going mad. I dismissed it as a trick of the wind or my own weary mind. It was only this morning, when I saw the empty case, that I understood. It was no trick, it was a herald. The parallels were chilling, but for Holmes they were illuminating. He completed his examination of the case and the library with a swift, silent efficiency, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He found the same minute gritty residue on the windowsill of the library's large French door, and upon microscopic inspection, an identical set of two faint, parallel scratches on its more complex brass lock mechanism. The method was the same, only the target had changed. As our carriage rattled back through the sleeping streets of London, Holmes sat perfectly still, his chin upon his chest, his eyes closed. I knew better than to interrupt his train of thought. The city's gaslights flickered across his sharp features, making him look like a statue carved from pure intellect. "He is escalating, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "The first theft was an instrument, a complete entity. The second is a component, an accessory. This signifies a refinement of his obsession. He is not merely collecting, he is perfecting his arsenal. He believes he requires not just any violin, but the finest violin. And now, to do it justice, the finest bow. This is a man assembling the ultimate tool for his art, piece by impossible piece." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "And consider the victims. Alastair Finch, a financier known to sit on the board of the Royal Academy of Music. Lord Harrington Smythe, a patron of the London Symphony and owner of one of the finest private collections of musical manuscripts in Europe. Our thief is not choosing houses at random. He is targeting collectors with deep, public connections to the highest echelons of the musical world. He is not just stealing from the wealthy, he is stealing from the cognoscenti. He is making a statement. He is demonstrating that their guardianship of these treasures is a sham, that he alone possesses the skill and the audacity to truly wield them. This is a performance of contempt as much as it is of theft. The pattern was no longer just emerging. It was a glaring beacon, and it was leading us directly into the soul of a brilliant, obsessive, and profoundly arrogant artist. The fog that night was a living thing, a thick pea soup blanket that swallowed sound and sight whole, muffling the distant clatter of carriage wheels and reducing the gas lamps to faint, shimmering halos of sickly yellow light. It was in this spectral atmosphere, within the winding paths of Regent's Park, that the legend of the Masked Violinist truly left the drawing rooms of the wealthy and seeped into the very soul of the city. The account did not come to us from a peer or a financier, but from a simple night watchman named Arthur Higgins, a man of stout character and no imagination whatsoever, whose testimony, precisely because of its lack of flair, carried the chilling weight of absolute truth. Higgins was making his rounds near the boating lake, his footsteps echoing dully in the oppressive silence. It was then that he heard it, the music, not faint and distant as it had been for Finch and Smythe, but shockingly near, clear and resonant. It was that same sorrowful melody, the one that seemed to speak of lost loves and forgotten graves. But here in the open air, it was raw and unrestrained, each note hanging in the moist air before being devoured by the fog. It was, he said, the most beautiful and the most terrible sound he had ever heard. Compelled by a mix of duty and dread, Higgins followed the sound. It led him to a small, open glade, and there he saw the source. A tall, gaunt figure, clad head to toe in a long, black coat that seemed to absorb the feeble light, The man's face was entirely concealed by a stark white mask, smooth and featureless, but for two dark slits for eyes, a void where a face should be. In his hands was a violin of rich, dark wood, and he was playing it with a fierce, passionate intensity, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm of his own devastating lament. Higgins stood frozen, his lantern held aloft, too terrified to move or cry out. For a long moment, the masked figure continued to play, seemingly oblivious to his audience. Then the music ceased mid-phrase, leaving a silence that felt louder than the melody. The featureless mask turned slowly toward the watchman. There was no expression to read, no anger or surprise, just that blank, porcelain whiteness. The figure gave a slight, almost courteous bow. Then, with an impossible swiftness, he turned and melted into the wall of fog. Higgins, his heart hammering against his ribs, stumbled forward, but the violinist was gone. There were no footprints on the damp grass, no sound of retreating footsteps, only the lingering echo of that unfinished sonata and the slow, creeping tendrils of mist. When this account reached the popular press, as such stories inevitably do, the city's simmering unease boiled over into full-blown hysteria. The masked violinist was no longer a phantom thief. He was a supernatural spectre, a Paganini reborn from the grave to haunt London's foggy parks. My own notes from that period detail a dozen more sightings reported in as many days, a shadowy figure seen on a rooftop in Chelsea. The same melancholic strain heard drifting from a deserted churchyard in Bloomsbury. The public imagination had been captured, and fear, as it so often does, began to wear the garb of superstition. Yet for Holmes, the watchman's testimony was not a ghost story. It was a treasure trove of practical intelligence. "Observe, Watson, what Higgins has given us," he remarked, steepling his fingers as he passed the report. "The mask is not merely theatrical. It is profoundly practical. It conceals his identity completely, yes, but it also eliminates the one thing he cannot control during his performances, his own expression. A face can betray effort, strain, or even the simple human flicker of emotion. The mask reduces him to pure sound, an anonymous vessel for his art. It is the ultimate act of artistic control." He paced before the fire, his mind racing ahead. And his choice of venue, a public park in the fog, this was no accident. It was a calculated risk, a performance for an audience of one. A man he knew would be there. He is growing arrogant, Watson. He is no longer content to haunt the homes of his victims. He must now haunt the entire city. He is testing the limits of his own legend, and in doing so, he is revealing the very human arrogance that drives him. A true phantom would not need to bow. That single, chilling detail, the courteous bow, was, to Holmes, the most telling clue of all. It was a signature. It was the flourish of an artist acknowledging his applause, even if that applause was nothing but the terrified silence of a lone watchman. The game was deepening, and the stakes were now written across the front page of every newspaper in London. The following morning found us not on the fog-damp streets of London, but within the hallowed, hushed halls of the Royal Academy of Music. The air itself seemed thick with the ghosts of 1,000 practiced scales, and the ambition of young prodigies. Holmes, usually so at home in the grit and grime of the city, moved through the marbled corridors with a new kind of intensity, his sharp eyes missing nothing. The calloused fingertips of a passing cellist, the respectful awe in a student's glance toward a stern-faced professor. We were there by appointment to meet with the head of the violin department, a man named Professor Alastair Stirling, whose own reputation for brilliance was nearly as formidable as the institution's. Stirling's office was a chaotic symphony of sheet music, stacked high on every available surface, and the rich, faint scent of rosin and aged wood. He was a small, bird-like man with a shock of white hair and eyes that held a permanent, critical squint, as if perpetually listening for a note played out of tune. Holmes wasted no time on pleasantries. He produced a sheet of music manuscript upon which he had transcribed the fragmented, sorrowful melody hummed by the maid, Elsie, and later corroborated by Lord Smythe. Professor Holmes began, placing the manuscript on the desk before him. "I require your expert opinion. This phrase, what can you tell me about it?" Sterling adjusted his pince-nez and peered at the notes. For a moment he was silent, his lips moving slightly as he soundlessly played the melody. Then a look of profound recognition, mixed with something akin to reverence, crossed his features. "Good heavens, this is from Veracini's sonata in G minor, Opus 2, Il Trillo del Diavolo, the Devil's Trill, but not the famous, fiery final movement. This is from the second movement, the Largo e Mesto, vast and sad. It is perhaps the most technically and emotionally demanding part of the entire work." He looked up at Holmes, his expression grave. "To play this with the feeling you describe, to make a night watchman feel a sense of dread, and a financier feel a profound loss, requires more than mere skill. It requires a soul that has truly known sorrow. This is not taught, it is lived." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the professor. "And how many violinists in London could play it thus? How many possess both the technical mastery and the requisite depth of feeling?" Sterling sat back, steepling his fingers. "A handful, perhaps 4 or 5 of the principals in our major orchestras. A few more gifted soloists. But to play it in the dead of night, from memory with such conviction, that narrows the field considerably. You are looking for a virtuoso, Mr. Holmes, a rare and troubled one. This piece is not performed for joy, it is an exorcism." This was the opening Holmes needed. Troubled, he repeated, latching onto the word. "Precisely the quality I am interested in. Professor, I need you to cast your mind back. I am looking for a former student, a prodigy, undoubtedly, someone of immense, perhaps unparalleled, talent, but also someone who felt wronged by the establishment, someone who harbored a deep and abiding grudge against the wealthy patrons, the board members like Alastair Finch, who decide the fates of artists from the comfort of their leather armchairs. A brilliant mind that believed the world had denied it its rightful place." The question hung in the air, and Professor Sterling's face underwent a subtle but profound change. The academic detachment fell away, replaced by a deep and personal sadness. He was silent for a long time, staring at a point somewhere beyond the stacks of music. "There was one," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "His name was Adrian Lockwell, the most gifted student I have ever had the privilege, and the profound misfortune, to teach. His talent was supernatural. He could make a student violin sound like a Stradivarius. He could play anything after hearing it only once, but he was fragile. A vessel of pure, crackling sensitivity. He felt every criticism, every perceived slight, as a mortal wound." Sterling rose and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out an old, leather-bound student ledger. He ran a finger down a list of names until it stopped. He was set to win the Academy's premier scholarship, a full ride to study on the continent. It was his for the taking. But then the professor sighed, a sound of genuine regret. There was an incident. A gala performance for the board of patrons, including Mr. Finch. Adrian was to be the soloist. He was nervous, as all young performers are, but he was also arrogant, convinced of his own supremacy. Halfway through the Tchaikovsky concerto, his E string snapped. It happens to every violinist, but for Adrian it was a cataclysm. He froze. Utterly, he could not continue. He simply stood there on the stage, pale as a ghost, while the orchestra fell into a confused silence. The memory pained the old professor visibly. The laughter started in the audience. Not everyone, of course, but enough it was led, I am ashamed to say, by Alastair Finch, who made a loud, dismissive comment to his neighbour about the temperament of artists. Adrian heard it. Everyone in the front rows heard it. He threw his violin to the stage floor, a cheap factory instrument, but it was all he had, and he ran from the hall. We never saw him again. His scholarship was, of course, awarded to another. His potential, his magnificent future, was shattered in that single, cruel moment. He vanished, that was 5 years ago. Holmes's eyes were burning with the cold fire of certainty. And his grudge would not have faded, Professor, it would have festered. A man of such sensitivity, denied his destiny not by a lack of talent, but by a moment of human fallibility and the mockery of the very men who held his future in their hands. He would not blame himself, he would blame them. He would believe they were unworthy to even listen to his art, let less to judge it. We left the conservatoire with a name, Adrian Lockwell, and an address from 5 years prior, a shabby boarding house in a then disreputable corner of the city. It was a cold trail, but to Sherlock Holmes, it was the first warm ember of a solution. We were no longer hunting a phantom. We were hunting a man, a ghost with a name, a history, and a heart full of music and vengeance. Our search for a man with a name now led us to a place of faded glory. A stark contrast to the gleaming halls of the Academy, or the opulent mansions of his alleged victims. The address from the student ledger was in a warren of narrow streets near the docks, a part of London where hope seemed to have given up and moved out long ago. The building was a leaning, soot-stained structure that smelled of damp laundry and boiled cabbage. The landlady, a formidable woman with arms crossed over a flour-dusted apron, confirmed that an Adrian Lockwell had indeed rented a room on the top floor 5 years ago, but he had disappeared one night without paying his final week's rent, leaving behind a single, battered suitcase. Quiet he was, she recalled, her eyes narrowing as she peered into the past. Pale fellow, nervous, always had that case with him, the long one, didn't bother nobody, but you could hear him sometimes, late at night. Playing that violin of his, sad music, it was, the kind that makes you want to have a good cry, and you don't even know why. She led us up 3 flights of groaning stairs to a tiny garret room under the eaves. It was barren, cold, and filled with the ghosts of shattered dreams. Holmes, with the quiet reverence of an archaeologist uncovering a lost civilization, began his examination. The room told a story of a life pared down to its barest essentials, a life wholly consumed by a single, all-encompassing obsession. There was a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a single wooden chair, and a small table. But it was the walls that held the most telling evidence. They were not bare. They were papered, not with wallpaper, but with sheets of music manuscript, meticulously pasted over every available inch of plaster. They were not random selections. They were complex, fiendishly difficult etudes and concertos, many annotated with frantic, precise notes in a spidery hand. Scribbled in the margins, over and over again, were 2 names, Finch and Smythe, each time circled and underlined with such force the pencil had nearly torn through the paper. On the table, next to a single guttered candle, was a large, leather-bound scrapbook. Watson opened it, and we were granted a window into the depths of a brilliant, broken mind. It was a meticulously curated archive of every society page announcement, every concert program, every newspaper article that featured Alastair Finch or Lord Harrington Smythe. Here was a photo of Finch cutting the ribbon at the new Academy wing. There, a review of a soirée at Smythe's Mayfair home, praising his impeccable taste. But these were not keepsakes of admiration. They were records of resentment. Next to each clipping were more of those frantic annotations. Unworthy. Philistine, he listens but does not hear. The final page was the most chilling of all. It was the program from the fateful gala performance where Lockwell's string had snapped. Across it, in large, angry letters that screamed across 5 years of bitterness, he had written a single sentence. They must learn to listen. Holmes, who had been silently running his fingers over the music-papered walls, suddenly stopped. He carefully peeled back one corner of a sheet of manuscript to reveal the plaster beneath. There, scratched into the wall with what must have been the point of a bow or a knife, was a diagram. It was a complex, geometric pattern of lines and angles, a precise schematic of a locking mechanism. It was the blueprint for a theft. He did not just dream of revenge, Watson, Holmes murmured, his voice filled with a kind of grim awe. He studied for it, he composed it, note by note, just as he would a symphony. This room is not a home, it is a rehearsal space. And his performance is now reaching its crescendo. We had found the sanctuary of the ghost, and it was filled with the sheet music of his vengeance. Yet for all the compelling evidence that seemed to point directly at the disgraced prodigy, a detective of Holmes's caliber knows that the most obvious solution is often a carefully laid trap. The very perfection of the scene in Lockwell's room, the manifestos of resentment so openly displayed, the damning schematics felt, to his mind, almost too theatrical, too complete. A true obsessive, he posited, often conceals his deepest plans, guarding them with a possessive secrecy. To leave such a blatant roadmap felt less like a confession and more like a performance designed for an audience. And so, with that characteristically restless intellect, Holmes pivoted, refusing to become fixated on a single thread when the tapestry of the case offered others, perhaps woven with more subtlety. This line of inquiry led us to a figure of an entirely different nature, Sir Gideon Vane, a man whose wealth was as vast as his presence in society was conspicuously absent. If Adrian Lockwell was a phantom of the slums, Vane was a spectre of high finance, a recluse who haunted the gilded cages of his own making. His name surfaced not from the musical world, but from the gossip columns of the financial papers, which chronicled his legendary, almost pathological, pursuit of rare artifacts. His collection was said to be unrivaled, a trove of impossible acquisitions gathered behind the walls of his Mayfair mansion, items that had simply vanished from the known world into his private possession. His was a museum without visitors, an art gallery for a single, unseen patron. Holmes secured a copy of the auction catalogue from the sale where Alistair Finch had acquired his Stradivarius. There, buried in the dry, officious text of the proceedings, was a footnote of immense significance. The final 2 bidders for the violin had been Finch, and a proxy acting for an anonymous client. The bidding war had been fierce, escalating to a sum that stunned the room before Finch emerged victorious. The identity of the underbidder was a closely guarded secret, but for a man with Holmes's web of informants, few secrets remain intact for long. A discreet inquiry with a clerk at the auction house, who remembered the day with vivid clarity, confirmed it. The anonymous, relentless underbidder was Sir Gideon Vane. The clerk recalled the man's agent, stone-faced and implacable, continuing to signal bids long after every other contender had dropped away, only finally ceasing with a look of cold fury when Finch's final, astronomical offer was made. This established a motive far more primal and direct than a 5-year-old grudge, the raw, unadulterated desire for possession. Vane was a man accustomed to winning, to absorbing beautiful, unique things into his private universe. The Stradivarius represented not just an instrument, but a prize that had been denied him, a singular failure in a life of total acquisition. For a collector of his obsessiveness, such a defeat would be an intolerable itch that could only be scratched by obtaining the object by any means necessary. His public feud with Finch did not end at the auction house. Society pages later noted a bitter war of words conducted through letters to the Times, with Vane decrying Finch as a mere custodian, without the soul to appreciate the instrument's true worth, and Finch retorting that Vane sought only to imprison art in a vault, away from the world. Where Luckwell's potential motive was one of artistic vengeance and symbolic revenge, Vane's was one of pure, simple covetousness. He did not want to play the violin, he wanted to own it, to complete his collection, to erase the one blemish on his record of total conquest. The theft of the taut bow from Lord Smythe, another famed collector, only deepened the suspicion. It fit a pattern of targeting the prized possessions of his rivals, a way of demonstrating that their victory in the public arena was meaningless if he could simply take what he wanted from the privacy of their own home. He had the resources to hire the finest, most discreet criminals in Europe, men who could perhaps devise a method to bypass a locked vault without a trace. He existed in a world where money could solve any problem, and the acquisition of the Stradivarius had become his most pressing problem. In the shadowy world of ultra-wealthy obsession, Sir Gideon Vane stood as a stark reminder that the most dangerous phantom might not be a disgraced artist, but a thwarted king who refused to be denied his crown. The sheer volume of evidence, pointing in two entirely different directions, created a cacophony in our sitting room, a dissonant chord that refused to resolve. On one side, the tragic symphony of Adrian Luckwell, all raw nerve and artistic vengeance, his grudge laid bare on the music-papered walls of a garret. On the other, the cold, acquisitive silence of Sir Gideon Vane, a man for whom ownership was the only art form that mattered, two compelling motives, two plausible phantoms. I found myself utterly divided, my mind swinging like a pendulum between the wounded artist and the scorned collector. But for Sherlock Holmes, the cacophony was not a problem to be solved. It was the very key to the solution. He sat amidst the storm of our investigation, perfectly still, his eyes closed, and on his face was the serene expression of a man listening not to the noise, but to the singular, pure note hidden within it. He had been silent for nearly an hour, the only movement the occasional drift of smoke from his pipe. I had learned not to interrupt these profound silences, for they were not periods of inactivity, but of furious internal computation. Suddenly his eyes snapped open. They did not focus on me or on the clutter of papers around us, but on some invisible point in space, blazing with a light of pure, unadulterated revelation. He did not shout or startle. Instead, he rose with a slow, deliberate grace, walked to his violin case, and took out his own instrument, not the stolen Strad, but his own dependable, if less illustrious, fiddle. He placed it beneath his chin, closed his eyes once more, and began to play. The melody that filled the room was the same one we had been chasing, the mournful, descending phrase from the Veracini. He played it through once, perfectly, capturing that same haunting sorrow that had chilled the blood of a night watchman. Then he stopped, he looked at me, and the connection he had made was almost visible. A brilliant thread of logic spun from the ether. "We have been fools, Watson," he said, his voice low and vibrant with energy. "We have been listening to the lyrics of this mystery, but ignoring its underlying rhythm. We have two suspects, each with a powerful motive, each capable in their own way of orchestrating these thefts, but we have been asking the wrong question. We have been asking why these items were stolen. The true question, the question that cracks this case wide open, is why these specific items together." He began to pace, his words coming faster now, each one a piece of the puzzle clicking into its irrevocable place. Consider the targets with the precision of a master luthier tuning his instrument. First, a Stradivarius violin, specifically the one known as the Betz, crafted in 1698, prized for its unparalleled depth of tone in the lower register and its sweet, singing quality in the upper. Then a taut bow, the very pinnacle of the bow maker's art, made by Francois taught himself from Pernambuco wood, renowned for its perfect balance, its responsiveness, and its ability to produce a phenomenally clear, articulate spiccato, that rapid, bouncing stroke. He stopped and turned to me, his gaze intense. Individually, they are masterpieces, but together, Watson, together they are not merely a violin and a bow. They are a key. They are the one and only combination of tools on this earth capable of executing a specific, legendary musical lock. A lock that has remained unpicked for over a century because no violinist, no matter how gifted, has ever possessed both the key and the audacity to turn it. He snatched a heavy, leather-bound volume from his shelves, A History of Baroque Music, and thrust it open to a well-worn page. There was an engraving of a wild-eyed, almost demonic man, violin tucked under his chin, and the title beneath it read, Giuseppe Tartini, and the dream that gave birth to the Devil's Trill. The story is well known in musical circles, treated as a charming superstition. Holmes explained, his finger tracing the text. Tartini claimed the devil appeared to him in a dream, snatched his violin, and played a sonata of such inhuman virtuosity and terrifying beauty that it haunted the composer for the rest of his life. Upon waking, Tartini desperately tried to transcribe what he had heard, but he always maintained that what he managed to write was a mere shadow of the devil's own performance, a piece he called Il Trillo del Diavolo, the Devil's Trill. He tapped the page emphatically. The sonata is not merely difficult. It is, by the account of every violinist who has attempted it, practically unplayable as written. It demands double-stopped trills in impossible positions, left-hand pizzicato while maintaining a melody, leaps that defy the natural position of the hand. It is a work of musical insanity. For generations, musicians have believed the problem was with the transcription, that Tartini simply failed to accurately capture the devil's music. But what if the problem was not the composition? What if the problem was the instrument? The brilliance of his deduction was staggering. The Betz Stradivarius, I breathed, beginning to see it. Precisely, Holmes exclaimed. Its unique tonal qualities, its responsiveness coupled with the flawless articulation of the taut bow, they are not a luxury for this piece. They are an absolute necessity. The subtle nuances of pressure required for the floating spiccato in the final movement, the specific resonance needed to make the double-stopped passages sing instead of screech, no other combination in the world can produce the specific sounds Tartini is sonata demand. The legend isn't that the devil played it. The legend is that it can be played at all. And the only way to prove the legend true, to finally play the devil's trill as it was meant to be heard, is with this violin and this bow. He looked at me, the final piece of the puzzle, settling into place with a chilling certainty. Our thief is not merely a collector or a vengeful artist. He is a purist, an idealist of the highest, most obsessive order. He is not stealing to own or to spite. He is stealing to complete. He is assembling the ultimate tool to solve the ultimate musical puzzle. He intends to perform the impossible, and that, Watson, is a performance we simply cannot miss. And so the melody we have been chasing leads us back, not to a London fog, but to an Italian bedchamber in the early 1700s, and to a composer haunted by a dream. Giuseppe Tartini, a man already celebrated for his virtuosity, awoke one night in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, his mind ringing with a music so terrifying and so beautiful it seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. He claimed that the devil himself had appeared at the foot of his bed, had snatched his violin, and had then proceeded to play a sonata of such impossible complexity and unearthly passion that Tartini, a master of his craft, could only listen in paralyzed awe. When the fiendish performance concluded, the devil vanished with a mocking laugh, leaving the composer alone in the silence, forever changed. Driven by a frantic need to preserve this spectral music, Tartini seized his pen and paper, scrambling to transcribe the notes that still echoed in his mind. But when he was finished, he stared at the manuscript in despair. What he had captured, he would later confess, was the merest shadow of what he had heard. The devil's performance had been a thing of fire and air, a symphony of the supernatural, and his own human composition was, in his own words, so inferior to what I had heard that I would have broken my instrument and abandoned music forever if I could have but lacked the means to live. He named the piece Il Trillo del Diavolo, the Devil's Trill. This was not merely a composer's fancy. It was the birth of a legend that would ripple through the centuries, gaining power with each failed attempt to conquer it. The sonata's final movement is a thing of nightmarish difficulty, a whirlwind of musical challenges that push the very limits of human physiology. It demands the violinist perform rapid, percussive trills with 2 fingers on 2 different strings simultaneously, all while a third finger must somehow maintain the melody on a third string, a physical contortion that seems to require a third hand. It calls for passages where the left hand must pluck the strings to create a pizzicato rhythm, while the bow continues to soar away at a separate, singing line. It is a work of beautiful madness, a puzzle that countless violinists have attempted, only to be defeated by its fiendish complexity. Over time, the legend grew, evolving from a story of infernal inspiration into a cautionary tale of artistic obsession. Whispers began to circulate in concert halls and conservatoires that the sonata itself was cursed, that to play it was to invite a kind of madness, a descent into a frustrated mania from which a musician might never return. Some said it could break a violinist's spirit, leaving them a hollowed-out wreck, forever haunted by the ghost of the music they could not master. It became the white whale of the repertoire, an ultimate, unattainable goal that promised glory, but delivered only despair. For generations, the greatest minds in music believed the problem lay in Tartini's transcription, that he had failed to accurately notate the devil's own notes. But Sherlock Holmes, with his singular perspective, saw a different truth. What if the failure was not in the composition, but in the tools? What if the music wasn't impossible, but was simply waiting for the one key that could unlock it? A key forged from the rarest materials, a specific Stradivarius violin, and a specific taut bow. The legend of the cursed sonata was no longer just a Gothic horror story. It was the very blueprint for our thief's magnificent, terrifying ambition. The notion of a supernatural culprit was one I could not entirely dismiss, I confess, and I found myself giving voice to the very theories circulating in the popular press. Watching Holmes pore over his diagrams and chemical analyses, the idea of a ghostly musician seemed, in a strange way, almost more plausible than the reality of a man who could walk through walls. It is a compelling narrative, is it not, Holmes? I ventured one evening, gesturing to the stack of newspapers filled with accounts of the masked spectre. A figure that vanishes into fog without a footprint, a melody that chills the soul, objects that disappear from locked rooms. When one eliminates every natural explanation, does not the unnatural, however improbable, begin to demand consideration? Perhaps we are not hunting a man at all, but a phantom, a restless spirit drawn to the instruments it loved in life. Holmes, who had been delicately applying a drop of reagent to one of the grey-white particles we had collected from Finch's windowsill, did not even look up. "My dear Watson," he said, his tone one of affectionate exasperation, "you have, as ever, a novelist's flair for the dramatic, but you have committed the most fundamental error in logic. You have not yet eliminated every natural explanation. You have merely eliminated those which first present themselves to the ordinary mind. To declare the work supernatural is not a conclusion of deduction. It is an abdication of it. It is the intellect surrendering to superstition." He set down his pipette and finally fixed me with that piercing, logical gaze. "Consider the facts not as a story for a magazine, but as a physician would a set of symptoms. A ghost, a spirit, a demonic entity. Why would such a being require a mask? A disguise is a tool for a mortal who fears recognition. Why would it need to bow? A gesture of acknowledgement implies an audience, a need for validation that is a profoundly human vanity. And most crucially, why would a supernatural force need to employ a complex, physical powder to defeat a mechanical lock? A spectre could simply pass through it." He picked up the particle again. "This, Watson, is not ectoplasm. This is the residue of a very clever, very human mind at work. Our ghost breathes, he plans. He leaves behind the faintest traces of his passage. He is flesh and blood, and it is our task to prove it, not to ascribe his works to the netherworld, because the solution is not immediately apparent." In that moment, the classic dynamic of our partnership was laid bare. My role has often been to represent the common sense and the emotional intuition of the public, to voice the awe and the wonder that such mysteries inspire. It is the part of me that never ceases to be amazed by the brilliance of my friend. Holmes, in turn, is the unshakable pillar of reason, the unwavering beacon of logic that cuts through the fog of fear and speculation. He did not mock my theory. He simply dismantled it with a calm, irrefutable precision that grounded our entire endeavor back in the tangible world. He reminded me that the true marvel was not the possibility of a ghost, but the undeniable reality of a human intelligence capable of creating the illusion of one. The game was not supernatural. It was afoot, and it was profoundly, fascinatingly human. The pattern we had come to expect was shattered with the third incident, a development so brazen it redefined the entire nature of the threat. The target was no longer a private collector in his mansion, but Maestro Frederick Ashworth, the renowned and temperamental conductor of the London Philharmonic, a man who resided in a modern, well-secured apartment overlooking the Thames with a live-in valet and a state-of-the-art alarm system. The object of the intrusion was not a theft in the conventional sense, but something far more psychologically unsettling. The maestro awoke to find not a missing treasure, but a delivered one. There, resting on the silk pillow next to his head, was a single sheet of pristine, cream-colored manuscript paper. It was not blank. Upon it was exquisitely handwritten, in ink so black it seemed to absorb the morning light, the opening bars of a piece of music. The notes flowed across the staves with a confident, almost aggressive flourish. It was the first page of Tartini's Devil's Trill sonata. There was no forced entry. The alarm logs showed no disruption. The valet, who had sat reading in the next room until midnight, heard nothing but the distant hum of the city. The phantom had not come to take. He had come to give. He had slipped past every defense, not to steal a material object, but to deliver an intellectual gauntlet, thrown directly onto the pillow of one of the most powerful figures in the musical establishment. This was not a crime of acquisition. It was a crime of proclamation. The message was as clear as it was terrifying. The Masked Violinist was announcing that the preparatory phase was over. He had acquired the tools he believed were necessary, the Betz Stradivarius and the taut bow. Now he was moving to the next, more audacious stage of his plan, the performance itself. Leaving the music with Ashworth, a conductor famous for his own failed attempts to find a soloist capable of doing justice to the devilish composition, was a calculated act of mockery. It was a taunt directed at the entire musical elite, a statement that their centuries of failure were about to be rectified by a lone, unseen master. The goal was shifting from possession to demonstration, from revenge to legacy. He was no longer just a thief, he was an artist claiming his stage, and he was sending his invitations in the most chilling way imaginable. The sheet of music left on Maestro Ashworth's pillow was not merely a message. It was a complex cipher, and Holmes approached it with the fervor of a cryptographer presented with a state secret. Under the magnifying lens in our Baker Street rooms, the pristine cream paper transformed into a detailed map of intent. It was not the printed notes of the Devil's Trill that held his attention. Those were widely available in any music shop, but the nearly imperceptible additions made by a precise, almost microscopic hand in a faint, sepia-toned ink. Holmes's finger traced the margin beside the first stave. Observe, Watson, to the casual eye, it is a mere smudge, a fleck of dust, but under magnification it reveals itself. It was a tiny, exquisitely drawn symbol, a miniature hourglass, so small it could be covered by the head of a pin. A few lines down, nestled between two dynamic markings, was another, a tiny skeletal key. These are not the doodles of a distracted mind, Holmes murmured, his voice taut with concentration. They are a deliberate code, a language of symbols for an audience of one, or perhaps for the performer himself, a set of private instructions woven into the very fabric of the score. His investigation moved from the margins to the staff lines themselves. Scattered throughout the frantic notation of the sonatas, most difficult passages were minute numerical sequences, written as fractions next to certain notes. 4/3, Holmes read aloud. 7/2, these are not time signatures, they are ratios, mathematical annotations. He cross-referenced these with a topographical map of London he had unfurled across the floor, his eyes darting between the music and the city's grid. They correspond to acoustical principles, Watson. The resonance of a specific note within a specific space. The thief is not just planning to play the piece. He is engineering its sound for a particular environment, calculating the reverberation time, the echo, the exact acoustic conditions required for his performance to achieve its maximum, terrifying effect. The final clue was the most audacious of all. On the back of the manuscript, in the same faint ink, was a single word written in a flowing, cursive script, Orpheum. The name struck a chord of recognition, a ghost from London's cultural past. The Orpheum Opera House, a once gilded palace of music and drama that had fallen into dereliction and financial ruin a decade prior. Its grandeur fading behind boarded-up windows and a shroud of neglect. It was a place of echoes and memories, scheduled for demolition in a matter of weeks to make way for a modern railway terminus. Holmes surged to his feet, the pieces of the puzzle crashing together in his mind with an almost audible snap. Of course, the hourglass, time is running out, the key. It is the key to the building, or the key to understanding the sonata itself. The acoustical calculations, they are for a large, resonant, empty hall. The Orpheum, it is perfect. His eyes burned with the fierce light of absolute certainty. He is not going to play in a private drawing room or a public park. He is staging a grand, final performance, a requiem for the building and a premiere for the ages. He will use the stolen instruments, the only tools capable of the task, to finally play the Devil's Trill as it was meant to be heard. in a venue whose own doom mirrors the cursed nature of the piece itself. He is not just a thief, he is a showman. He has assembled his ultimate instrument, and now he is sending out invitations to his opening night. The phantom was no longer hiding in the shadows, he was building a stage. The air in our Baker Street sitting room grew thick with the scent of tobacco and impending action. Holmes, a chart of the Orpheum's architectural plans, spread across the floor, moved across it on his hands and knees like a general surveying a battlefield. His finger, precise as a scalpel, traced potential paths through the opera house's labyrinthine underbelly. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, his voice a low, focused hum. "The stage door offers the most direct exit, but it is also the most obvious. A man of this intellect will prize misdirection above speed. He will anticipate our presence. Therefore, we must consider the secondary routes, the old scene dock corridor, which leads to a disused coal chute opening into the rear alley, and the access ladder to the fly gallery above the stage, which connects to the lighting catwalks and potentially a skylight on the western roof." He was not just predicting a path. He was inhabiting the mind of our adversary, thinking with his arrogance, his flair for the dramatic, his absolute certainty of his own superiority. I, for my part, attended to a more visceral form of preparation. From a locked drawer in my old campaign desk, I took out my service revolver. The weight of it in my hand was a familiar, grim comfort, a stark contrast to the esoteric brilliance of Holmes's deductions. I methodically checked the mechanism, the satisfying click of the cylinder, a metronome ticking off the seconds until our confrontation. I loaded each chamber with a cold, deliberate focus, the brass cartridges gleaming dully in the gaslight. It was a reminder that for all the talk of cursed sonatas and ghostly melodies, we were likely to be dealing with a desperate and cornered man. "You are certain he will be armed, Holmes?" I asked, my tone practical, medical. Holmes glanced up from his blueprints, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. "His instrument is his weapon, Watson, and his genius is his ammunition. But a man who goes to such lengths is a man who values his freedom above all else. He will have a contingency, a knife, perhaps, or a kosh. He is an artist, but do not mistake him for a pacifist. His performance tonight is the culmination of his life's work. He will not allow it to be interrupted." His assurance was chilling. He had moved past the question of if the violinist would appear. He was now orchestrating every moment of the encounter, a director setting the stage for his own climax. The final hour before our departure was spent in a silence that was itself a form of communication. Holmes meticulously assembled a small kit, a powerful bullseye lantern, a set of picklocks for any unexpected locked doors within the theatre, and a stout length of cord which he deftly coiled and tucked into his pocket. I ensured I had my medical bag close at hand, a habit born of experience that hoped for the best but prepared for the worst. We were a study in contrasts, the thinker and the man of action, the mind and the fist, yet perfectly aligned in our purpose. The faint, distant chime of a church clock striking 10 seemed to hang in the air, a final solemn note before the crescendo. Holmes rose, his figure tall and lean in his dark travelling coat, his eyes reflecting the firelight with an almost preternatural gleam. "The stage is set, Watson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the room. "The players are in position. Now we must take our seats in the audience and await the maestro's cue. The final act of the adventure of the Masked Violinist is about to begin." The Orpheum Opera House did not merely stand empty, it held its breath. As we slipped through a side entrance left treacherously ajar, the silence that greeted us was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy, dust-laden blanket that seemed to swallow our every footstep. The grand auditorium was a cathedral of decay. a vast, shadowy canyon where time itself had gone to rot. Our bullseye lantern cut a frail, wavering cone of light through the oppressive gloom, its beam illuminating swirling galaxies of dust motes dancing in the frigid air. The once opulent velvet seats stretched out before us in endless, ghostly rows, each one shrouded in a thick, grey pall of neglect, their crimson fabric faded to the colour of dried blood. High above, the cavernous space was dominated by the skeletal remains of a massive crystal chandelier, its 1,000 fractured pendants hanging like frozen tears, a few stray shards still catching the faint light in a feeble deathbed sparkle. A gaping wound in the domed roof allowed a single, brilliant shaft of pale moonlight to pierce the darkness, cutting through the interior like a celestial blade. This unearthly beam fell with theatrical precision onto the center of the stage, illuminating a single, lonely wooden chair placed there, as if awaiting a performer for a midnight recital. The air was cold and carried the unmistakable, mournful scent of old wood, damp plaster, and forgotten grandeur. Every whisper, every creak of the ancient floorboards beneath our feet seemed magnified 100-fold in the immense, resonant space, each small sound a potential betrayal of our presence. The shadows at the edges of the room felt alive, shifting and coalescing into forms that teased the corner of the eye, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. This was not a building. It was a tomb for a million lost melodies, and we were intruders in a place that had made its peace with silence. The stage was set, the audience of ghosts was in their seats, and we could do nothing but wait in the wings, our own hearts hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against the overwhelming, dread-filled quiet. We did not see him enter. One moment the stage was empty, a pool of silver moonlight waiting for its star. The next, he was simply there, materialized within the beam of light, as if conjured from the very shadows themselves. The effect was so sudden, so utterly silent, that it felt less like a physical entrance and more like a trick of the eyes, a phantom emerging from the deepest recesses of the mind. He stood perfectly still, a tall, gaunt silhouette against the dark velvet curtains, the stark white of his featureless mask gleaming with an unearthly luminescence. In his hand, held with a reverence that was almost sacred, was the Stradivarius, the fabled Betz violin, its rich, dark wood seeming to drink in the moonlight, appeared less like an object and more like an extension of the man himself, a dark heart waiting to beat. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was hypnotic to watch, each step a measured part of some silent, private ritual. He did not glance into the oppressive darkness of the auditorium where we hid. His entire world had already shrunk to the circle of light, and the instrument in his hand. He settled onto the simple wooden chair, his posture straight yet fluid, and for a long, breathless moment, he was perfectly still. He lifted the violin, his left hand cradling the neck with the intimacy of a lover's touch, while his right brought the priceless taut bow to rest on the strings. The entire decaying theatre seemed to lean in, holding its breath in anticipation. This was the moment he had orchestrated so meticulously, the culmination of theft, obsession, and genius. He was alone in a tomb of forgotten music, and he was about to conduct a séance. The first note was not so much heard as felt, a low, resonant G that seemed to vibrate up from the floorboards through the soles of my boots. It was a pure, clean tone that hung in the frigid air, a single, perfect teardrop of sound. Then came another note, and another, weaving together into the melancholy, descending phrase we had come to know so well, the opening of the Largo e Misto. But here in this vast, resonant space, played on these legendary instruments, it was transformed. It was no longer a distant melody reported by frightened witnesses. It was a physical force. The sound that poured from the violin was unimaginably rich, a deep, dark chocolate of a tone that seemed to fill every corner of the colossal hall. Each note had a life of its own, a clarity and a warmth that made the very air shimmer. It was beautiful beyond description, but it was a beauty that carried an immense, unbearable weight of sorrow. This was not music meant to entertain. It was a confession, a lamentation torn from the very soul of the player. He played with his eyes closed behind the mask, his entire body swaying gently with the rhythm of his own grief. The bow, guided by an unseen demon of technique, danced across the strings, producing a seamless legato that felt less like a performance and more like a single, unbroken exhalation of profound sadness. The acoustics of the derelict opera house, which Holmes had deduced the thief had so meticulously calculated, did not merely amplify the sound. They embellished it, adding a soft, natural reverberation that made the single violin sound like a string section, a ghost orchestra accompanying its lone soloist. The music washed over us, wave after wave of haunting, melancholic beauty, and I felt a tightness in my chest, an emotional response so powerful it was almost painful. This was the sound of a shattered dream given voice. This was the sound of 5 years of bitterness, of isolation, of furious, focused practice, all channeled through a piece of wood and horsehair to create something that was, in its own way, utterly supernatural. We were not just listening to a sonata. We were witnessing the resurrection of a ghost, and the ghost was playing its own requiem. The last, sorrowful note of the largo hung in the air, vibrating in the silence with a resonance that felt less like sound and more like a shared, profound ache. For a moment, the masked figure remained perfectly still. The violin and bow held in the final position of the phrase, as if he himself were part of the sculpture of his own grief. Then, from the deep shadows of the orchestra pit, a single, slow clap began. It was not a sound of mockery, but of pure, unadulterated appreciation, measured and precise. Sherlock Holmes stepped into the edge of the moonlight, his tall, lean figure emerging from the darkness like a spectre of reason itself. The Largo e Mesto from Veracini's sonata in G minor, Holmes said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the cavernous silence. Played not with the technical perfection of a studio recording, but with the raw, bleeding heart of a man who has lived every ounce of its sorrow. A remarkable feat, sir. Truly remarkable. You have proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that you are indeed a master of your instrument. The masked head snapped toward the sound, the blank white eyes of the mask fixing on Holmes. There was no movement, no sound, only the tense, waiting silence of a predator discovered. But you have made one critical error. Holmes continued, taking another step forward, his hands clasped behind his back, as if he were lecturing a gifted but wayward student. In your meticulous focus on the acoustics of this hall, on the engineering of your entry and exit, on the sheer virtuosity required to play this piece, you forgot to obscure the one thing that truly matters, the one clue that every artist, no matter how brilliant, inevitably leaves behind, his own emotional fingerprint. Holmes began to pace slowly at the edge of the stage, his gaze never leaving the frozen figure. The motivation seemed so clear. A disgraced prodigy, Adrian Lockwell, seeking vengeance on the establishment that laughed at him. Or a ruthless collector, Sir Gideon Vane, consumed by the desire to possess what he could not buy. Two compelling narratives, two perfect phantoms to haunt this case. But they were narratives you constructed, were they not, layers of misdirection to conceal a truth that was far simpler and far more tragic? He stopped and pointed a long, steady finger at the Stradivarius. The music, that was always the key. It was not the music of vengeance. It was not the music of avarice. It was the music of a desperate, yearning heart. It was the sound of a son crying out for the approval of his father. The masked violinist did not move, but a slight tremor seemed to run through the bow held aloft in his hand. From the very beginning, the emotion described by every witness was not fear, not anger. It was a deep, profound, and personal sorrow. A feeling of loss. Alastair Finch heard it from his bedroom and felt his heart ache. The scullery maid heard it and was moved to tears. Why would a thief intent on revenge or profit play with such vulnerable, heartbreaking emotion? He wouldn't unless the emotion was genuine, unless the performance was not for an audience of ghosts, but for one man, the first man you robbed, your father. Holmes's voice softened, taking on a note of pity. The impossible theft from a locked vault in your own home. Who else would know the combination but the son of the house? Who else could move through those rooms with such intimate knowledge, such unquestioned access? You staged the theft to create a mystery, a challenge so audacious that it would inevitably bring the one man to your door who could appreciate the genius of the solution. Sherlock Holmes. You needed a witness to your triumph, and you needed your father to hear you play the piece you failed all those years ago, played now to perfection on the instrument he prized above all else. You weren't stealing it to own it, you were borrowing it to prove yourself upon it. A low, broken sound escaped from behind the mask. It was half a sob, half a laugh of utter defeat. The bow stolen from Lord Smythe, Holmes went on. A necessary component for your masterpiece, yes, but also another collector your father respected. Another figure whose approval you secretly craved. This was never about the world. It was about the drawing room of your childhood home. It was always about him. With a hand that now trembled visibly, the figure reached up. There was a faint click, and the stark white mask fell away, clattering onto the wooden stage floor. The face revealed in the moonlight was young, handsome, and etched with a pain so deep it was palpable. It was unmistakably the face of Alastair Finch the younger, whom we had seen in portraits in his father's study, but now aged by years of bitter practice and lonely obsession. Tears traced clean paths through the dust on his cheeks. You understand," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. He wouldn't listen. He never listened. After that night after I failed, he only saw the humiliation. He never saw the work, the years of work. I could have played anything for him, but he only wanted to hear that I had given up, that I had come to my senses and joined the family business. He looked down at the priceless violin in his hands, a tool he had mastered but could never truly own. I just wanted him to hear me, really hear me. Just once. He lowered the instrument gently, carefully, placing the Stradivarius and the taut bow on the empty chair, as if laying a loved one to rest. He made no attempt to run. He simply stood there, his shoulders slumped. The fight and the music finally drained out of him. A boy who had gone to impossible lengths to play a song for a father who had never learned to listen. This desperate, meticulously orchestrated scheme was never truly about theft. It was not born of greed for wealth or a simple desire for revenge against a cold father. The stolen Stradivarius and the purloined taut bow were not trophies to be locked away and admired. They were the sole means to an end, the only tools on earth that could unlock a sound, and in doing so, unlock a father's heart. This was a tragedy of validation. A young man's entire sense of self-worth funneled into a single, impossible performance. Believing that artistic genius was the only currency his wealthy father would ever truly respect. Consider the immense pressure of being Alastair Finch the younger. His entire world was defined by his father's monumental success, a fortress of finance built from ledgers, acquisitions, and cold, hard logic. In that world, art and music were likely seen as pleasant diversions. charming hobbies for the wealthy, but not the serious work of a man. For a sensitive boy with a prodigious gift, this created an unbearable dissonance. The very thing he was most brilliant at, the talent that was his core identity, was deemed insignificant by the one person whose approval he craved most. His father's dismissive laughter at that fateful gala performance wasn't just a moment of embarrassment. It was a fundamental rejection of his son's entire being, a public declaration that his life's passion was a joke. And so a desperate, brilliant, and terribly broken plan began to form in his mind. He couldn't simply practice harder and play another concert. That path had already ended in humiliation. He had to do something so audacious, so undeniably ingenious, that his father would have no choice but to see him not as a failed musician, but as a mastermind. He would stage the perfect crime, a puzzle so complex it would baffle all of London, and he would use the very symbol of his father's wealth and taste, the priceless Stradivarius, as the centerpiece. He wasn't stealing the violin to own it. He was borrowing it to perform a miracle upon it, to achieve a musical feat his father could not possibly ignore. This is the profound tragedy at the heart of his motive. He wasn't seeking the world's applause. He was seeking a single nod of approval from the man in the front row. The haunting, sorrowful melody he played outside the homes of his victims wasn't a taunt. It was a cry. It was the sound of a lifetime of feeling unheard, poured into the one language he was fluent in. He was essentially shouting through his violin, "See me, hear me, understand what I can do." He crafted an elaborate, multi-act play of a crime, all to force his father into the role of audience member for a solo performance 5 years in the making. He even engineered the involvement of Sherlock Holmes, not just to be caught, but to be appreciated. He needed the world's greatest logician to validate the brilliance of his scheme, to certify his genius for his father in a way a music critic's review never could. In the end, the masked violinist's most devastating theft was not of material objects, but of his own future. He sacrificed everything, his freedom, his reputation, his relationship with his family, on the altar of this one desperate bid for paternal recognition. He believed that by playing the devil's Trill perfectly, he could finally conquer the demons of his past. Instead, he became consumed by them, a tragic figure who learned too late that no amount of stolen glory can ever fill the void left by a father's withheld love. Holmes gestured for the young man to take a seat upon the very stage where his dream had just crumbled, and in a voice stripped of all judgment, he began to unravel the magnificent, painstaking engineering of the thefts. The genius of your scheme, young Finch, was not in its grand theatricality, but in its meticulous attention to the smallest, most dismissible details. You understood that to create a true illusion of the impossible, one must master the mundane. He began with the windows. The first and most audacious hurdle was the height. Both your father's study and Lord Smythe's library featured windows a sheer 25 feet from the ground, with no drainpipes or trellises to aid a climber. A common burglar would have been defeated before he began. But you, with your intimate knowledge of the properties, knew that the old brass latches on those particular windows, while sturdy, were also their greatest weakness. They required only a quarter turn to open, and they were just wide enough to be manipulated from the outside with the right tool. Holmes produced from his pocket the tiny, gritty particles we had collected from both window sills. This was the final piece of the puzzle for me. A common dust, one might assume, from the decay of the old window frames or tracked in from the street. But under a microscope, it reveals itself as a very specific compound, a fine powder of pumice stone mixed with a minute quantity of beeswax. You applied this to the latch mechanism from the outside using a long, thin probe, perhaps hidden within your bow case. The abrasive pumice would grit into the moving parts, holding the latch in a slightly unseated position, while the beeswax acted as a temporary, silent lubricant. This prevented the telltale click that a well-maintained latch would make, allowing you to swing the window open and closed without a sound. The residue that fell onto the interior sill was the evidence of your precision. He then turned to the method of ascent. A ladder would be too conspicuous, too clumsy, but a musician is never questioned for carrying a long, narrow case. Within yours, I surmise, was a custom-built tool or grappling hook of a most ingenious design. Not the crude, three-pronged affair of a sailor, but a single elegant hook crafted from tempered steel, with a padded, leather-wrapped tip to muffle any sound of contact with the stonework. It would be attached to a silken rope, strong enough to bear your weight but thin enough to be easily concealed. You would launch it not to the fragile window ledge itself, but to the solid stone corbel or decorative carving just above it, a feature you knew from a lifetime of looking at those very walls. A few practiced pulls would secure it, and a man driven by a powerful purpose could scale such a rope with surprising speed. Once inside, Holmes continued, his voice a calm, forensic narrative. Your greatest advantage was not your tools, but your knowledge. You knew the exact placement of every floorboard that might creak in your father's house, having navigated those rooms in the dark since you were a boy. You knew the patrol route of the night watchman at Lord Smythe's, the timing of his rounds calculated from stories your father brought home from his dinner parties. The vaults and display cases were mere props in your play. The real locks you had to pick were those of habit and routine, and you possessed the master key for all of them. The theft itself was the simplest part. You took only the instrument or the bow, leaving all other valuables untouched, not out of some criminal honor, but because they were irrelevant to your goal. You then exited the way you came, carefully re-engaging the window latch from the outside with your tool, leaving it once again appearing perfectly locked and secured from within. The alarm circuit on your father's vault door was never broken because the door was never opened. You simply never went near it. The entire performance was designed to point towards an impossible intrusion there, a classic misdirection, while the true point of entry was the one place no one would think to secure so rigorously, a window 25 feet in the air. Holmes looked at the shattered young man before him. You did not walk through walls. You did not become a ghost. You used physics, chemistry, and an unparalleled understanding of human nature. You composed a crime the way you would a symphony, with every note, every rest, every dynamic marking in its precise place. It was, in its own way, a terrible and beautiful work of art. The heavy, rhythmic tread of official boots on the stage's wooden boards announced the arrival of the law long before Inspector Lestrade and his constables emerged from the wings. They moved with a grim, procedural efficiency that felt jarringly out of place amidst the lingering echoes of the violin's final, sorrowful note. Lestrade's face, usually a mask of professional smugness when making an arrest in Holmes's presence, was uncharacteristically somber. He took in the scene, the world's greatest detective, the weeping son of one of London's wealthiest families, and two of the most valuable musical artifacts in history, resting on a simple chair as if awaiting their next player. There were no triumphant proclamations, no smug satisfaction of a case closed. Lestrade simply nodded to Holmes with a look of quiet respect, then approached the young man with a surprising, almost paternal gentleness. "Alistair Finch," he said, his voice low and devoid of its usual bluster. "I must ask you to come with me." There was no struggle, no protest. The younger Finch simply nodded, his spirit seemingly as broken as the string that had snapped all those years ago. He offered his wrists for the cuffs, not with defiance, but with a weary acceptance, as if this were the final, inevitable movement in the symphony he had composed for himself. As the constables led him away, his figure small and defeated between their sturdy blue uniforms, he paused for a moment and looked back at his father's violin. It was not a look of covetousness or regret for the lost treasure, but one of heartbreaking farewell. He was not leaving behind an object of immense value. He was leaving behind his voice, his only true means of expression. The silence that followed his exit was heavier than any that had preceded it, filled not with the absence of sound, but with the crushing weight of what might have been. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, his sharp features illuminated by the single shaft of moonlight. The fierce light of the hunt had vanished from his eyes, replaced by an expression I had seen only on the rarest of occasions, a deep, contemplative pity. He was a man who dedicated his life to the dissection of motive, who viewed human folly and criminal ingenuity as problems to be solved, not tragedies to be mourned. But in this instance, the solution left a bitter taste. "The greatest tragedies, Watson," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the empty space where the young man had stood, "are not those born of pure evil, for evil is a simple equation to be balanced. The true tragedies are those born of misapplied genius, of a magnificent talent so desperately channeled in the wrong direction for want of a single kind word." He shook his head slowly, a rare gesture of profound regret. There is no vault in all of England that could have protected Alastair Finch from his son's need for approval. The most intricate lock ever devised cannot secure a heart against loneliness. We have captured our phantom, restored the stolen property, and yet I feel we have presided over a funeral for a talent that, with the right guidance, might have given the world unparalleled beauty instead of a fascinating puzzle. The following days saw the quiet return of the instruments. Holmes himself oversaw the delivery of the taut bow to a deeply chastened Lord Harrington Smythe, who accepted it with none of his former bluster, but with the quiet reverence of a man who had been forced to consider the terrible cost of his prized possessions. The Stradivarius was brought back to Finch Manor, and I accompanied Holmes as he placed the case gently into the trembling hands of Alastair Finch, the elder. The financier's face was ashen, his eyes red-rimmed. He did not open the case to inspect his treasure. He simply held it, his hands shaking, as if the weight of the wood and strings was nothing compared to the crushing weight of his own failure. He just wanted me to listen," the older man whispered, the words a painful confession. Holmes placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of comfort so uncharacteristic it spoke volumes. "It is not too late to hear him, Mr. Finch," Holmes said, his voice unusually soft. "His music may now be confined to a prison yard, but a father's ears are not bound by stone walls." Justice in its official capacity had been served, but true resolution, we understood, would be a much longer, quieter, and more painful composition, one that would have to be written not in notes, but in forgiveness and understanding. Back in the familiar clutter of our Baker Street sitting room, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the fog of London pressing against the window panes, Sherlock Holmes finally laid down his pipe. The physical pursuit was over, the culprit was in the hands of the law, but for my friend, the most critical part of the investigation remained: the dissection of the human motive that had orchestrated it all. He sat in his armchair, steepling his fingers, his gaze fixed on some middle distance where facts and psychology intertwined. The mechanics of the theft, Watson, were a masterpiece of practical application. He began, his voice low and analytical. But they were merely the instrument. The true melody of this case, its haunting and sorrowful theme, was composed entirely in the mind of young Finch. We are not looking at a simple story of crime and punishment, but a profound and tragic case study in the psychology of performance anxiety, taken to its most devastating extreme. He leaned forward, his eyes gaining their familiar, penetrating focus. Consider the initial trauma, that moment on the stage when his E-string snapped. For most, it is a mere embarrassment, a story to laugh about in later years. For a soul of such exquisite sensitivity, it was a cataclysm. In that instant, the fragile construct of his self-worth, built entirely upon his musical prowess, shattered as completely as the silence in that hall. The laughter, particularly his own father's, did not just mock a momentary failure. It invalidated his entire identity. He was not Alastair Finch, the son. He was Alastair Finch, the failure. And that is an identity a proud and gifted mind will fight to the death to erase. This is where the quest for external validation becomes a destructive poison. Holmes continued, gesturing with the stem of his pipe. His sense of self became so externalized, so dependent on the approval of one man, that he could no longer see his own talent for what it was. He was like a painter who, unable to trust his own eyes, must constantly ask others if the sky is blue. His solution, therefore, was not to look inward and rebuild, but to stage a performance so grand, so undeniably brilliant, that it would force the world, and specifically his father, to finally see him as he so desperately needed to be seen. He was not stealing a violin. He was attempting to steal back his own worth from the eyes of his audience. And this, he said, his tone softening almost into pity, brings us to the mask. Its practicality as a disguise is obvious, but its psychological function was far more profound. That blank white porcelain was not just a concealment, it was a liberation. Behind it, he was no longer the shamed son, the disgraced prodigy, the anxious boy. He was an archetype. He was the phantom of the opera, the masked avenger, the mysterious maestro. The mask allowed him to shed the persona that had failed and adopt a new one he believed to be powerful, infallible, and worthy of respect. It was a crutch for his shattered ego, a shell into which he could pour all his skill without the terrifying vulnerability of being seen. He could finally perform without the fear of being judged as himself. The irony, of course, is that in creating this perfect, untouchable artist, he completely erased the very person he was trying to prove existed. Holmes sighed, a rare sound of genuine world weariness. And so we see the tragic loop. The fear of failure led to a desperate need for validation, which required a monumental performance, which in turn demanded a mask to manage the anxiety of that performance, which ultimately ensured that any validation received would be for a phantom, not the man. He constructed an intricate prison of his own design, all to receive a key that would not fit the lock of his own cell. The greatest tragedy is that the performance we witnessed in that derelict opera house was indeed genius. But it was a genius he felt he could only express from behind a shield, forever ensuring that the applause he so craved would never truly reach him. He fell silent, leaving the echo of that profound psychological truth to hang in the air between us, a more haunting melody than any played on a stolen Stradivarius. Back in the familiar comfort of our rooms at 221B, with the fire casting dancing shadows and the familiar sounds of London's carriages drifting up from Baker Street, a peculiar silence had settled. The case was closed, the players had departed the stage, and yet a ghost remained, lingering in the air between the bursts of flame in the hearth. It was the ghost of a melody, that haunting, sorrowful phrase from the Veracini sonata, and it seemed to have taken up permanent residence in my mind. I found myself at my desk, the familiar weight of my pen in hand, a fresh page of my journal open before me, but the words would not come easily. Ordinarily, the act of writing up our investigations is a process of ordering chaos, of taking the tangled threads of a mystery and weaving them into a coherent, logical narrative. It is a comfort, a way to impose sense upon the senseless. But this time the threads were not just those of deduction and evidence. They were threads of profound human sadness, and they refused to be woven into a simple tale of crime and solution. My usual opening, I find myself recording another of my friend Sherlock Holmes's most remarkable cases, felt utterly inadequate, a trivial preface to a deep and troubling symphony of the soul. The image that persisted behind my eyes was not that of the masked phantom on the stage, but of the unmasked boy, his face raw with a pain so profound it seemed to have aged him decades in an instant. I had chronicled murders born of greed, of revenge, of political intrigue. I had seen the darkest corners of the human heart, but I had never documented a crime born of something so simple, so universal, and so desperately sad as a son's need for his father's approval. The intricate engineering of the thefts, the brilliant misdirection, the sheer audacity of the performance, all of it, every note, was ultimately just an extraordinarily elaborate cry for help. It was a shout of "See me," composed in the most complex language its author knew. This forced me to confront a question that lies at the very heart of my friend's work, and indeed at the heart of the human condition itself. Where does genius end and madness begin? In Adrian Luckwell, or rather in young Finch, we saw them not as separate states, but as two sides of the same coin. His was a mind of such exquisite sensitivity and focus that it could master the unmasterable, could hear and replicate the very sound of sorrow itself. That same mind, when wounded, could then conceive and execute a plan of breathtaking complexity, all in the service of a single, emotional need. Was it madness to go to such lengths? Or was it simply genius applied with a devastating, misguided purity? The line between them is not a bright, clear border but a blurred and shifting moor, and he had become tragically lost upon it. Holmes so often speaks of the logic of crime, of the clean, beautiful line of deduction that cuts through the fog of emotion and misunderstanding. And indeed, his logic had solved the puzzle. He had followed the evidence of the gritty powder and the faint scratches to their brilliant conclusion. But the motive, the true engine of this entire affair, was the absolute antithesis of logic. It was raw, unadulterated emotion, a need for love and recognition so powerful that it overrode every rational consideration of consequence, of morality, of self-preservation. It proves a truth I have long suspected, that even the most logically constructed crimes are almost invariably born in the turbulent, illogical depths of the human heart. We may chart the course of the bullet with physics, but we must understand the rage that pulled the trigger with empathy. And so, as I finally set my pen to paper, I realized I was not just recording another adventure. I was composing a requiem for a talent that might have soared, but instead had flown too close to the sun of its own desperate need, its wings scorched by the coldness of a father's gaze. The echo of that melody will always be, for me, the sound of that loss, a beautiful, terrible reminder that the most impenetrable vaults are not made of steel, but of silence, and the most valuable treasures are not objects to be owned, but connections to be nurtured. The case of the Masked Violinist was solved, but its music and its tragedy would play on in the quiet moments long after the final page was written. And so we reach the final, haunting chord of our investigation into the Masked Violinist, a case that began with a single, sorrowful note hanging in the London fog and unfolded into one of the most psychologically complex and emotionally resonant puzzles of Sherlock Holmes's career. What appeared at first to be a ghost story a spectre that walked through walls and vanished into the night, was, in truth, a profound human tragedy composed of equal parts genius and desperation. Holmes's brilliance in this instance was not just in following the physical clues, the minuscule scratches on a window latch, the gritty residue of a custom powder, the specific acoustics of a derelict opera house, but in listening to the emotional frequency that hummed beneath it all. He understood that the true mystery wasn't how the thefts were committed, but why the melody that announced them was so universally described as heart-breaking. That simple, shared detail was the key that unlocked everything, leading him from an impossible crime to a fractured family, and proving once again that the most impenetrable vaults are not made of steel, but of silence and pride. This adventure stands as a masterclass in the art of deduction, showcasing Holmes's unique ability to see the person behind the puzzle. He didn't just solve a case, he diagnosed a soul, recognizing that the masked violinist was not a criminal in the common sense, but an artist whose magnificent talent had become tragically entangled with a desperate cry for recognition. From a fragmented tune hummed by a frightened maid, Holmes built an entire psychological profile, identifying a performer of rare skill, then used that profile to untangle a web of misdirection that pointed to two compelling, yet ultimately false, suspects. His final stunning revelation in the moonlit ruin of the Orpheum was not an accusation, but an intervention, a moment of heartbreaking clarity that exposed a son's plea to his father. A performance years in the making where the only desired prize was a moment of earned respect. A sincere thank you for lending your ears and your curiosity to this investigation. If you found yourself captivated by the twists and turns of this musical mystery, if you felt that chill at the sound of a phantom violin, or that thrill as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place, then consider lending your support to this channel. Your likes and subscriptions are the applause that lets us know you want the curtain to rise on more investigations like this one. And now the floor is yours, the audience. The game is always afoot, and we want to know where we should venture next. Should we delve into the spectral horror of the Hound of the Baskervilles, unravel the deceptive simplicity of the Red-Headed League, or perhaps confront the intellectual challenge of the Musgrave ritual? Share your suggestions in the comments below, and let us know which classic Sherlock Holmes story you'd like to see dissected in our next thrilling episode.